Advocacy in the U.S. This is a webinar organized by An-Najah National University's Political Science Department and the Faculty of Law. And my name is Michelle Browers. I will serve as your moderator today. I am a professor at political science at Wake Forest University, and this past year I've been a visiting researcher with An-Najah National University. Wonderful hosts, and I appreciate my colleagues in political science inviting me to be a part of this event today. I want to thank you all for taking time to be with us here and for bearing with us as we navigate through our webinar using Zoom's interpretation feature. To facilitate the use of the interpretation feature, please keep the following in mind. You can access interpretation through the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. Once you click on interpretation, you'll see 3 channel operations. Original audio, which is no interpretation. You'll hear the proceedings in whatever language the panelist is presenting in, which will be in English and Arabic. To avoid hearing both the spoken language and the interpretation, please select mute original audio, and this option can be seen beneath the 3 audio channels when you click on the globe icon. So please now switch to the Arabic channel if you are an Arabic speaker, because all panelists will be speaking in English. I want to say thank you in particular to our wonderful volunteer interpreters, Shireen and Rania, and ask that our panelists keep in mind that we are interpreting this and translating this, and to speak slowly if you can remember to do so. And a note to myself, of course, as well, to speak slowly. I want to turn things over to my colleague, Raed Davi from the Department of Political Science at An-Najah University, to welcome us on behalf of this university. Dr. Raed.
Thank you very much, Dr. Michelle. Dear friends, colleagues, students, and honored speakers, in the behalf of the administration of An-Najah National University and in the behalf of the Faculty of Law and Political Science, I would like, first of all, to thank you all for having you. For us, it is more than a panel, it is more than academic webinar. It is a voice for justice, it is a voice for peace, a voice for solidarity with Palestinian people, and a voice for the right of all people in this globe, in the security, in the peace, and in the self-determination. I would like, before starting, to thank and to give a special thanks to my colleague Alia from the International Department for the very great work she did and the very great effort she dedicated in order to make this very unique and very prestigious panel happening. I think it is a very timely one due to the situation on the ground. As you all know, today is the 17th of April, and the 17th of April is the Prisoners' Day in Palestine. That should remind us that there is more than 9,100 Palestinian political prisoners still in the Israeli jails, including around 200 women and including more than 550 children. And that should always remind us that, as Nelson Mandela said, our freedom will be incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinian people. Our struggle for freedom and justice is part of the struggle of the humans for a globe and for a world free of aggression, free of wars, and free of injustice. This voice is very important, especially when we speak about the Palestinian voices in US. Yesterday, I guess you all heard about the news about arresting tens of Palestinians that they tried to raise their voice in the streets of US and to call for ceasefire and to call for stopping the Israeli aggression and genocidal policies against the Palestinians in Gaza Strip. For us, we always differentiate between the American people and the American administration. We do believe that we have great friends and believers in peace and justice in US, and all the polls and even the situation on the ground showing us that there is better understanding from the American grassroots to the Palestinian rights, while we still face the classical positions of the American administration against our people. Tomorrow, the UN Security Council will vote for accepting Palestine as a state in the Security Council, and we will wait and see if America will vote differently and will choose the right side of the history, or will do the same and make this rendezvous again with cowardness instead of making it with the right side of the history. Anyway, I don't want to take more time from this panel, but I would like to thank you all for your great work. Again, thank you for all the speakers. Thank you, Dr. Michelle. Thank you, Alia. And welcome all from An-Najah National University, colleagues, students, and from UK and other countries as participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Raed. I do think this is a very important topic to be discussing in this moment. And again, thank you for being here. The webinar discussion aims to deepen our understanding of the impact of pro-Israeli lobbying in American politics. It has been designed to hopefully equip both the local Palestinian community and the international partners who stand in solidarity with that community with the knowledge and terminology needed to effectively raise awareness about the current landscape and narratives of US policymaking toward Palestine and Israel and the intersection of domestic and foreign policy matters. Our hope is that the information and analysis that's provided here will prove helpful for those seeking to develop a strategic approach to balance political dynamics and to align support with human rights values in our advocacy for Palestinian rights. The panel or the webinar is in a panel format. I have three colleagues joining me today. Laura Friedman, president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, who is an expert on US domestic and foreign policy towards Palestine. As well, Iman Abed Thompson, director of advocacy and organizing for the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights, USCPR, who is also formerly the regional director of the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union in New York. And finally, Zaha Hassan, who is a human rights lawyer and a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, who brings a lot of knowledge to this as well. The way we've structured this is, as I said, a panel format. I have 5 questions. I'm going to pose those questions to one individual and then ask the other 2 individuals to add their comments as well. The 5 questions will be followed by a Q&A period, and I invite all of our participants to use that function at the bottom of the screen, Q&A, so that we can pose the questions. So my first question goes to Zaha Hassan. We've seen growing criticism of Israeli actions in regard to Gaza, particularly recently. It did take a while, but it's certainly growing over time. For example, just this past week, a coalition of a dozen liberal organizations and labor unions sent a letter to the White House demanding that President Biden end military aid to Israel until its government lifts restrictions on humanitarian aid. And even the Washington Post published an editorial affirming the need to set strong conditions on aid to Israel in their editorial. But for the most part, what we've seen is US governmental support for Israel be unwavering. What accounts for this?
Thanks for the question, and thank you to An-Najah for inviting me, Dr. Raed, and thank you to Alia for all her organizing. I want to start off by saying just what an honor it is to be invited by An-Najah. It's an institution I respect very much, and I want to acknowledge how difficult it has been for students, in particular in Najah, to get to school, to be able to engage live with their instructors and their professors. It's been a very trying time since October 7th, and so I just want to acknowledge that and just thank you for having me with you. So that's a great question, Michelle. The story of why the U.S. policy is just so rigidly fixed on supporting Israel, even during times like these, when we have seen 2-ton bombs dropped on civilian populations. We've seen entire neighborhoods wiped out in controlled bombings. These aren't even just the bombs that drop from the air, but just rigging entire areas up to destroy them. Churches, mosques, universities, and we've even had the ICJ now step into the picture and say, you know, this is a plausible genocide that's taking place. But we still have seen, like you said, an administration that is unwilling to move. And, you know, there's a lot of folks that try to make us understand this by simply pointing to President Biden and saying, you know, he just really loves Israel. He sees himself as a Zionist. He has said things like, if Israel, you know, didn't exist, then the United States would need to invent it, you know. And, you know, I don't think, you know, that tells you part of the story, but I don't think that tells you the full story. It's much more endemic and structural to the United States, what this relationship consists of. And, you know, it bears, you know, deconstructing that a bit to understand it. Yes, you know, the Israel and the United States are countries that have similar origin stories, and they have natural affinities because of that. There are, you know, longstanding Jewish American constituencies in the U.S. that support political Zionism. They're very well organized. They are very effective in advocating for Israel in the United States. We have a sense in the U.S. that you know, U.S. didn't do what it should have done during World War II, didn't enter into the war early enough, or didn't do enough to protect or bring in Jewish refugees that were escaping genocide at the time. And so there's that component of the relationship that the U.S. has with Israel, and this need to keep Israel as a safe refuge for Jews. But it was really only after the 1967 Arab-Israeli conflict that we saw this relationship between Israel and the U.S. really grow. There was an idea that, you know, Israel was going to be this bulwark in the Middle East that was going to, you know, represent U.S. interests and be a proxy for the U.S. and stand out against the Soviet Union. And so from that period on, you saw a lot of security assistance going from the U.S. to Israel to support Israel in that role. Things obviously changed after the Soviet Union fell apart, and we had a new threat, and that threat became international terrorism. And after 9/11, we saw Israel effectively be able to frame Palestinian militant resistance against Israel as part of the international terrorist threat, and use language like shared values and shared interests to solidify that linkage. And that's when you saw a lot of the support for Israel in terms of military cooperation, intelligence sharing, and that kind of thing really develop. This was also the same period that we saw Christian Zionists enter the political scene more prominently to advocate on behalf of Israel, citing, again, the shared Judeo-Christian history and values. And, you know, Christian Zionists, for those who don't know, they believe that the second coming of Christ depends on Jewish control of the Holy Land. And so the U.S. support for Israel has been sort of instrumentalized by them as a way to bring about the end of times prophecies. And if you think this is like really far-fetched, and, you know, it's not something that is widely shared among certain Christian communities in the U.S., then, we had an example of this just recently. Pastor John Hagee, he is a extremely influential religious figure in the United States who founded a Christian Zionist organization called Christians United for Israel that boasts 5 million members and has chapters all around the United States and on college campuses. And last week, when Iran struck back at Israel in retaliation for the bombing of Iran's consulate in Syria, Hagee spoke to his followers to announce that he'd be traveling to Washington with 250 other religious leaders to talk to members of Congress about supporting Israel's military response following the Iran bombing of Israel. He cited Bible verses about Gog and Magog and the end of times to justify this U.S. support for Israel. So, I mean, it's very real, this movement in the U.S. Christian Zionists are not the only advocates for Israel in Washington. There are weapons manufacturers and security contractors who lobby on behalf of greater security assistance to and cooperation with Israel. These lobbyists reinforce the notion that the U.S. has shared security interests with Israel that require heavy U.S. investment in Israel. Many of us challenge this notion, however, because when we consider just how Israel has been, for example, in this present period, striking at its neighbors throughout the Middle East and really egging on sort of escalation in the region and bringing potentially the U.S. into it. This doesn't look like something that the U.S. wants, yet it may end up getting engaged on the side of Israel, which is not within the U.S. National interest, but it may happen, and it's again it counters this idea that there should be this alignment with Israeli interests, or that Israeli interests automatically align with U.S. interests. So with these domestic interest groups advocating for unconditional support from the U.S. to Israel, you can understand why Israel is not only a foreign policy issue here, it's also a domestic political issue. U.S. elections take a lot of money. This is something that you probably, if you're living outside of the U.S., you don't understand as so well, but you need lots of money to get ad time on TV. You need to pay for, your campaign in ways that you don't in other countries during elections. And so to get that kind of money, you need organized political action groups to give you, large sums of money to pay for these things. And groups like Christian Zionists in their different lobby groups, the weapons industry, organized legacy Jewish organizations that are pro-Zionist, all of these groups help fund elections, and they are able to get their agenda out there with elected officials. So far, the pro-human rights community, pro-Palestinian diaspora community, Arab Americans don't have the same access to funds and the same organizational structure. They're building those structures, but they don't have them, and they haven't had them in the past. And so they don't have the same ability to push their agenda with members of Congress the way these other groups are able to. Still, despite these powerful interests, as was noted, I mean, we do see a lot of change and shifting in public opinion in the U.S. Generally, foreign policy isn't a big interest for most Americans unless it involves American troops on the ground in some country where we're in a conflict. But even among average Americans who don't rank Palestinian Israeli matters high on their list of concerns, for many years now, they've been saying that they want an even-handed U.S. approach. And writ large, they generally support a political solution that is fair and that is consistent with rights and equality and these kinds of issues. Unfortunately, we don't have yet the political power to push that agenda with members of Congress. And that's why you're seeing this difficulty in getting the public opinion to match with a U.S. policy still. that doesn't describe, or that doesn't explain why Biden, for example, the Biden administration still is not moving, because there are now members of Congress and a lot of political power on the streets that are pushing for a change in policy. It hasn't changed Biden yet, and for many people, it's inexplicable because electorally, it actually might benefit him to be listening to these groups, especially in states that are key to his winning the election. He hasn't done it yet, and it might just be muscle memory with him, that he doesn't know how to break out of this mindset that has enabled him for 50 years of his career to be successful as a politician. But I'll stop there and wait for my colleagues to tell me how I'm wrong.
Thank you. That was so helpful, that overview. Lara or Iman, would you like to add anything? Iman, you want to start?
Sure. Hi, all. Salam alaikum to all those. And I also just want to echo something Zaha said at the very beginning, how honored I am to be a part of this incredible panel. Just much respect to Zaha and Lara and everything that they've been doing, and to the university and all that y'all have been carrying in this moment, in the last 6.5 months in particular. I know it's no easy feat. I myself am Palestinian, my family's in the West Bank. So my heart is right there alongside all of you in this moment, and just appreciate everything that you all have been trying to contribute to. I know I'm not going to challenge what Zaha said, as someone I look up to, and I appreciate everything you've shared, Zaha. I think in particular, I would want to just address, I know at the beginning there was this stated fact around, like, it's not just President Biden's responsibility, right? This is an issue that has inherently been founded upon in American society and the fabric of American governance. But I particularly just want to add some comments around President Biden's role and why he specifically and unequivocally has stated his support to Israel over these last few months, let alone, since the time of his tenureship as a senator. And for the last 45 years, he's been nothing but close to Israel. He's established prominent relationships with every single prime minister dating back to Golda Meir. And he has also, as I want to repeat the line that Zaha mentioned, but if Israel didn't exist, we would have to invent it. And I think it re-emphasizes this need that the United States want to kind of use Israel as a proxy in the region to be able to kind of build out its own interests, business interests, and have some sort of stable relationship within the region to be able to build up its own imperialist agenda. And Biden has been an advocate for that for his entirety in his tenureship, again, in American politics. He can be stated back to 1992 at an AIPAC conference. He boasted about being the senator that was going around funding the most for AIPAC. And I know we're going to talk about the American Israeli Public Affairs Council in a little bit. But, this is a role, the AIPAC PAC system itself, which I know we'll talk a little bit about again in a second, is a great part of Biden's legacy. It is something that he has boasted about. He has been funding for since, again, for the last 45 years. And I wouldn't necessarily want to miss out on the fact that that does play a huge role in how he's chosen to show up in these last couple of months. And he even spoke out against folks like George H.W. Bush, who in the midst of peace process negotiations said that George Bush was too harsh on Israel for trying to withhold the aid that was being sent to Israel at the time. So he's been no stranger to standing beside Israel unequivocally. And I think there's tons of statements that are out there by President Biden that we can account for to uphold in this specific, case. And even as, in 2010, I want to acknowledge that Netanyahu was building settlements in the West Bank. It was up for criticism. It was up for it was a very controversial take here in the United States. And yet Biden again stood by Netanyahu and didn't necessarily criticize him for what he was doing. So there have been repeated moments and attempts that President Biden has had to be able to, stand away from it, but he has shown nothing but that additional support for Israel that he's been committed to in these last 6.5 months. So for anyone who has known him, he is proud to be a Zionist and will stand by Israel no matter what it is doing. And we've watched that unfold. But with that, I'll pass it to Lara.
I just want a quick reminder to our panelists to speak slowly for our translators. Thank you so much for that, Imam. Lara.
Thank you, and I want to add my voice to Zaha and Iman. It's an honor to be here, this august panel, and thank you to the organizers for putting this together. And I'm really, it's very humbling given all that's going on to be speaking on this topic to this audience in this venue. So thank you very much. I would agree with everything that's been said previously. I would just add a couple things. I think it's important for people to know that support for Israel, however you think about that or define that, and you should probably in this context define it in the most hardline, Zionist, greater Israel terms. Support for Israel is now part of the fabric of the GOP, the Republican political view. This started more than a decade ago with the Tea Party. It escalated with Trump. For the Republican hardcore base, support for Israel is red meat. It's right up there with abortion, anti-abortion. It's right up there with anti-LGBTQ. It's right up there with anti-immigration. It's part and parcel of what people think of now as the anti-woke agenda. And that's important because the anti-woke agenda in the US, which is this idea of pushing back against these horrible liberal ideas that are corrupting our great country, which is largely in terms of white history. That agenda has now been tied by people in the Republican Party to allegedly fighting anti-Semitism. And this is very, I think, convenient for those in the Democratic Party who really want to never let Republicans become seen as more pro-Israel than they are, and that includes in the White House. And it also, with anti-Semitism genuinely being an issue on the agenda, there is genuine rise of anti-Semitism, the conflation of anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel and support for Palestinian rights, and this predates October 7th, that conflation is being weaponized in US politics like never before. I mean, we had this conflation in the past, but today, I mean, at this very moment, there's a hearing, I believe, still going on in the House with a major university, basically about how we attack students for being supporters of Palestinian rights. All of this is happening, as both the previous speakers have said, in the context of a US election campaign. And, you think about for the Biden administration, where you have a president who's personally, he is 100% honest. I agree with Iman 100%. This is where he is. He is a Zionist. He means it. You should believe him. And on top of that, his political advisors are no doubt telling him that every inch that he moves to show that he actually cares about Palestinians or Palestinian rights, or he's concerned about, for example, the one thing he's willing to talk about, which is settler violence, ignoring the fact that settler violence is state violence. We all know that. In every inch that he moves in that direction, he is then attacked. And we've seen it since the Iran retaliation last weekend. He is basically portrayed by the far right of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party as having betrayed Israel. So when you think about the political pieces that are in play as we're in the countdown to a major election, and this is both, we can talk later about elections in states and at the local level, but at the presidential level, when people say, how is it that he's not moving? We're seeing all of these people protesting, and we're seeing people at the grassroots saying, I may not vote for you. Why is he not moving? The answer is partly that's who he is and where he is and what he believes is right. And part of it is, I would have no doubt, that he has advisors saying that shifting at all will cost you even more than what it's costing you to not shift. So there's a political calculation here, which has nothing to do with right or wrong or morality or genocide or anything else. It has to do with somebody's election analysis. By the way, I'd say that analysis may well be entirely wrong, but it's intuitively feels correct, so it doesn't almost even matter if it's wrong.
So our three panelists have outlined a number of forces at work shaping U.S. foreign policy decisions related to this conflict and to our policy towards Palestine and Israel more generally. This next question I want to take back to Lara. And I'm seeing in the Q&A, a lot of questions of why the United States continues to veto even things like ceasefire resolutions, even the mildest of condemnations. Why, when ICJ says there's plausible genocide 2 months later, we've seen the same policy and there's been no rebuke. And I wonder if you could put in one piece in this analysis. We know, I mean, it's well known that the pro-Israeli lobby exercises a lot of power in US politics. And I wonder if you could explain in just the most basic terms how lobbying works, how this lobby works, and how it's come to operate so successfully in American politics.
Sure. And I appreciate the question. It's actually a simple question, but it's a fairly simple but also complex answer. The simplest answer is, and for people who are maybe not as familiar with the US political system, this may not be quite so obvious, but our political system is designed to be lobbied. And, you know, for people who focus on Israel and organizations that lobby on Israel, I would encourage you to also look at organizations like the NRA, or I mean, pretty much every issue has its core group of lobbyists. And what is notable, and, you know, back in the day, I'm old enough to remember when AIPAC, which is the premier Israel, it's called the Israel lobby. They will, of course, say that calling the Israel, until recently, they were not an actual lobby. They were the Public Affairs Committee, which is ridiculous because they did lobby then. But now they're officially a lobby and they actually fundraise. But, you know, back in the day, they used to have written on the cover of their annual book that was passed out at their annual conference, something like recognized as the most powerful foreign policy lobby in Washington or something. I mean, they were proud of it. You know, the bottom line is they're enormously effective. They're not doing anything that is in any way illegal or wrong in our system. They have figured out how to work our system incredibly effectively. And I think there's a lot of other lobby groups which have looked at AIPAC as the example of how you do this. And the bottom line of how you do this is you spend years building infrastructure in cities, in states, and then at the federal level. And AIPAC invests in this year after year in a way that involves a huge amount of money and a huge effort and huge infrastructure. And along the way, they build, you know, cadres of people who view Israel issues through the lens that AIPAC gives to them, who visit Israel with AIPAC and are guided to understand it that way. Or they don't visit with AIPAC, they visit with AIPAC's allied organization, because some years back they had to there's law that doesn't let AIPAC travel, it doesn't let people travel as lobbyists with members of Congress, so they spun off a foundation, which is part of AIPAC effectively, that takes them. The bottom line is they effectively they build relationships at this level, and then over and over, year after year, invest. If you go to the AIPAC Policy Conference, you'll see students there. From very young up through college. You'll see student leaders. You'll see leaders of not just, I mean, there's been focus on the police, but it's also civic organizations, it's civil rights organizations, it's, you know, minority groups that are fighting for rights, and they make common cause on the common values or on economic ties or whatever. And then along the way, they build those ties and people get elected to Congress and people work in congressional offices. And then they promote legislation and they engage in the elections process directly now. They have a PAC. They, I think, last year were one of the biggest spenders in the Democratic primaries, investing money to defeat progressives who were seen as not sufficiently pro-Israel or who were seen as anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian. You know, this is how our system works. And the challenge here for a lot of people when talking about this, and you're thinking about what can you do? The starting point has to be understand that this is how it works, and this is how our system works. And some of the answers, unfortunately, go to whether or not people are willing to change, you know, campaign finance, whether they're willing to change what is allowed in lobbying. And those are much bigger questions than Israel-Palestine questions.
Zaha, do you want to go or add anything to that?
Yeah, just to underscore what Laura said about just the amazing infrastructure and how it operates at all levels. I mean, I have just an example in my own family. My daughter was president of her university, and all presidents of universities apparently get invitations from AIPAC to go to Washington and attend their conferences. And my daughter was was approached to attend the conference when she was president. And, you know, she asked me, what should I do? I said, you should accept, you should go, you know? And so she told them, okay. And then they sent her a questionnaire, and then they asked her, you know, which church or synagogue she goes to. And when she said she goes to a mosque and she identified who her parents were, she was disinvited. So just to say, I mean, you know, it's pretty amazing that you can invite every, you know, president of every college in the United States to go to a conference like that. So that just shows you the level of infrastructure that they've built up. It's not just the formal lobby, you know, that one that I described that includes these other constituencies. It's also these different civil society groups, NGOs that also operate in this ecosystem that supports this kind of pro-Israel bent. So, you know, one of the most important things you can do if you're trying to counter a narrative, or if you're trying to build power and you're trying to organize to oppose this kind of thing and support human rights for Palestinians, is you need to have access to be able to put your opinion out there, put your position out there, whether that's in social media or other kinds of platforms. And so one of the things, you know, that we've seen in this particular moment, where we're seeing all this, you know, very spontaneous, but also some well-organized campaigns to challenge what's going on in Gaza, for example. You see a lot of activity from members of this ecosystem, this pro-Israel ecosystem, trying to clamp down on social media content moderators and to force them to redefine speech that supports human rights in ways that, you know, labels it as anti-Semitic or terroristic. Or we're even seeing here the conversation turn to whether or not we should be banning TikTok from the United States because it's too divisive. Divisive meaning, you know, it's the preferred mode of communicating this anti-war position among young people, and it's threatening to the pro-Israel ecosystem that is out there. So there's all this other adjacent to the lobby kind of work that goes on, but it's really not accidental. It's deliberate. This infrastructure has been built for over a long period of time, and it's very difficult then for those who are just coming into the fray now, trying to organize, trying to counter these structures, to be able to do so effectively and be able to translate that into a change in U.S. policy.
Thank you. Iman, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think that immediately, I think most of our minds, when we think of pro-Israel lobby, we think of organizations like AIPAC and the presence of these sorts of organizations and alliances within government institutions. But I also like to acknowledge the fact that this dates back to even before the construction of the state of Israel. I mean, there is something that I was able to uncover from the year 1917. There were these creations of the Zionist lobbying firm that has started to promote itself here in the US, built out what they called Palestine camps. And I'm from a small town originally in upstate New York. And so think of less than 300,000 people in this city. And what they did was they built up this Palestine camp to start actually inviting members of the Jewish community to understand the concept of Zionism and what it meant to its, you know, and what it actually meant to folks here. So in order to garner support over the decades, this is like decades in the making. This is not something that just happened from the construction of Zion, you know, construction of AIPAC. This is, as both my colleagues have said, like this is decades in the making. There are different ways in which the pro-Israeli firm has showed up. And I think that it's been successful. Unfortunately, it's been extremely successful. And the intricacies of the dynamics of the coalitions it's formed, be it through, you know, community organizations, partnerships with education. I'm not just talking about colleges and universities. I mean, even public education systems. You'll find the pro-Israeli lobbying firm kind of caught up in those systems as well. It doesn't necessarily matter. I think you could find some way to trace back a pro-Israeli lobbying firm into every single facet of American society. And so again, because they've been able to do that for the last few decades, it's been very difficult to unpack, and we don't have the power to completely destroy and deconstruct it. But it is something that people have been aware of. I want to also acknowledge that I think, specifically the pro-Israel firm has been smart in the sense that the moment that folks started to understand that its main agenda was to promote Israeli policies and to promote this relationship between the United States and Israel, it started to kind of create new alliances and constructions. So it started to use dark money a lot of the time and being able to funnel through, additional pro-Israeli contributions to members of Congress or whatever it may be, to kind of start making the environment a little bit more difficult to follow and trace. And so even as dissent started to form around Israel in the last couple of decades, it's now been able to create this new alliance so that it's become far more difficult to be able to trace back exactly to, these direct Israeli lobbying firms. So it's finding new and innovative ways to be present and to be, be able to build its strength and its power. But I think people have been out, trying to outsmart the system and still being able to identify and target what's been going on.
Can I just add one more thing?
Yes, of course.
I mean, looking at the ecosystem, and I think both of my colleagues have mentioned this broader ecosystem. It's not just AIPAC, it's not just one group. I think it is important to recognize that one of the issues when you sort of ask how has it been able to operate so effectively, one of the ways is we now have an ecosystem of organizations, and it's not just AIPAC, it's the Anti-Defamation League, it's the American Jewish Committee, it's the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations. These are organizations that have been around for decades and decades. And they claim to speak for all Jewish Americans. That's part of their inherent power, is that they are viewed as representing all Jewish Americans. If you look at polling of Jewish American views, they don't, right? But again, that's part of that's part of the game of lobbying here. When they want to say, well, how do Jewish Americans feel? And politicians are looking to see this. They look to these organizations. And they're the organizations who have that ability to say, we speak for everyone as one voice, when they don't. And that's still, I do think that's one of the things that's starting to change. I know we'll talk about that later, but the basis of their power is claiming to represent something that I don't know if it's ever been true that they represented the majority of anything, but certainly today with a new generation, and we're talking about intersectional alliances, I think that's something that is very much changing and starting to get thinner and thinner, the veneer that's true.
I think to that point, we're starting, I mean, we've seen sort of a new generation of congressional leaders come into office. And last week we saw an old voice. We saw U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren state that there's ample evidence that leads her to conclude that Israel's actions against Gaza will be found to have met the legal definition of genocide, although she later watered down her comments. I wonder if you could address the question of progressive political figures in the United States. And I'll ask first maybe if that's the right term for them and how you would define them. If not that, why is it so hard for them to speak out against Israel's actions, let alone to advocate for Palestinian rights? And maybe I'll start this question with Iman, because of from the state of New York, right? You have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who came in and raised the issue of Palestine and has been very outspoken from the beginning of her time as a representative. Why is it so hard for these figures to speak out effectively for Palestinian rights?
Yeah, well, I should say I am from New York, but I'm calling everyone here from Washington, D.C. But both states are incredibly relevant as we speak to this issue. And so one thing I want to mention, and it kind of takes us back to some of the responses we were all providing from the previous question. You can't talk about the fear coming out of members of Congress and why they are so terrified of being pro-Palestinian without talking about the existence and presence of AIPAC and the ADL and all these other organizations that so quickly chase after these members of Congress for even sharing the slightest bit of criticism on Israel. And it could have nothing to do with, being pro-Palestinian. It could be more around the violations of international law or the fact that the U.S. money isn't being spent in the way that it was, originally allocated for. And these sorts of things, anytime there's any bit of criticism, you have someone like AIPAC come in and immediately put out a comment, whether it be on Twitter or whatever it may be, to just showcase backlash. And you could watch just how these members of Congress oftentimes actually get inundated with calls and emails from people who supposedly don't stand with these sorts of statements, and in fact are trying to censure or criticize these members of Congress for doing the slightest bit. In the case of Elizabeth Warren, for the last 6.5 months, we've been asking her to make the statement around a total and permanent ceasefire, as it's been our top demand here for the people of Gaza, and trying to ensure that it's been done. I will say that it's not been an easy feat. Elizabeth Warren has kind of been vocally critical of the state of Israel, but has also been kind of, again, moving slowly on that. And I think it's because of fear. It definitely is because of the fear that we've been witnessing here. And specifically with this, though, that you've just acknowledged, she finally came out and said, wait a minute, this actually could be genocide, is a huge factor around the fact that the Palestinian movement here has grown tremendously in the US, and is actually, while it may not have the same social and political power that some, the pro-Israel lobbying firms has, it is definitely still able to move members of Congress in a way, because it's become an issue of moral consciousness, not just an issue of legality, but an issue of like, where do you stand on morally? So it's moving and it's influencing members of Congress. So I think that there's an acknowledgement around that specifically. There is also the fear, not just, again, of rhetoric that's being used by pro-Israeli lobbying firms. There are also these political challenges that oftentimes, folks like AIPAC and any sort of, aligned PAC have kind of situated themselves around. And that's, these firms, these lobbying firms are actually coming in and physically challenging, putting people up against these members of Congress when it comes time for the re-elections, and throwing money down the drain. Hundreds of millions of dollars are getting thrown in to races just to shut out members of Congress from being able to ever speak out again. And we also see that, we've seen it, this is a specific big year. This is an election year, not only for President Biden, but for many members of Congress and many vocal members of Congress that have supported, Palestinians and have even dared criticize Israel. I want to talk a little bit about some of the examples around how, these pro-Israel lobbying firms have tried to shut people down. And it would be hard to not talk about folks like Rashida Tlaib, who just recently in November of 2023 were censured for her remarks on Israel. The only Palestinian American representative was literally a resolution was passed to shut her up and be able to kind of call her out and just, essentially shame her for this criticism of Israel. We also had the issue of last year in February of 2023 with Ilhan Omar, when she was removed from the Foreign Affairs Committee, when she said it's all about the Benjamins, and the acknowledgement regarding how Republicans are moved and easily funded for by AIPAC. She was calling out a sentiment that is actually quite true, but even then was also criticized for it and then removed by a committee that she was a fierce leader. And she still is someone, and Rashida Tlaib is also still someone who still choose to criticize Israel. They have kind of stood against the adversity and been an incredible advocates when it comes to Palestine. But in this specific moment as well, we are seeing the challenges and the amount of money that they are able to spend. Unfortunately, AIPAC and all these, again, pro-Israel lobbying firms can easily outspend anyone when it comes to these election cycles. And I think that we've seen that already. Just the funding, the membership of the AIPAC, space itself has grown tremendously over the last couple of years. And in this election cycle is already it's spending over $100 million to defeat progressive candidates who have been supportive of Palestine. They're putting up there's Democratic primaries for people like Summer Lee and Ilhan Omar, who have had primary challengers, but I want to say successfully have also, those two candidates in particular have actually been able to outspend AIPAC, which is tremendous. It's quite actually not an easy feat, as I just mentioned. Again, AIPAC has a lot of money and it's extremely difficult to do, but these two candidates have been able to do. And then there's also candidates like Cori Bush, who are getting, run up by AIPAC funded challengers. The name Wesley Ball is the name of the opponent running against Cori Bush here in the US. And unfortunately, the opponent is is outspending the current a member of Congress in office. And Cori Bush is one of the two legislators who helped introduce the ceasefire resolution that we have been also heavily working in favor of. So there are a lot of challenges being brought up, and so people are fearful. People are fearful of what might happen. I mean, this is happening to predominantly squad members at this moment, but it's not something to be taken lightly. So the chilling effect has definitely resonated across through to folks like Elizabeth Warren and many others, and just continues to be something that's at the forefront here.
mindful of the time, I think I want to go to the next question because I really want to make sure we get this conversation turned around to things like what is being done to confront the influence of this pro-Israel lobby, and maybe more generally, what's the status of counter efforts of supporters of more pro-Palestinian policies, and what might be done to make them more effective? I wonder, Zaha, do you want to start with this question? And if you had anything to add to Iman's comments on the last question, maybe if you could insert them with the intention of turning this around to the what is to be done question.
I'll go right into this. I think Iman covered that last question very well. There is no substitute to building power. You have to build power in order to make change. It's obviously not, you're not going to get policymakers to look at what's happening in Gaza and say, that's a genocide. We need to cut off offensive weapons to Israel, which would be the logical thing to do, given the images we're seeing, given what we know about what's going on from human rights organizations, from UN experts, from humanitarian workers. I mean, that should have happened if policymakers were just about doing the right thing, right? So it's not just about doing the right thing. You have to have power behind you. So it's going to take a very well organized movement, and we're seeing it happen now. I mean, just yesterday we had bridges closed down, we had highways blocked off, we had all kinds of efforts around the country. I'm sorry, this was on tax day, which was a couple days ago, but it was on tax day to make the point that we don't want US taxpayer money going to fund an apparent genocide. So that has to grow, that has to get more organized, but there's no substitute to building power. I think the other thing that we need to be mindful of is a good defense. There's just, as I mentioned earlier, there's a concerted effort to shut down all protest and dissent because it's so effective, because this movement is becoming effective. And we're starting to see that with the fact that you get a senator saying, okay, maybe there's a genocide taking place. That's a huge thing in the US. So what's happening is, we're seeing, legislation to prevent people from being able to publish things, being able online. As I mentioned, we're seeing shutting down of popular platforms. We're seeing mass protests being targeted. People that organize mass protests, and somebody does something that is an illegal act, whether that's blocking a road, can now be held responsible for whatever happens during the protest. I mean, that obviously is going to disincentivize people from organizing mass protests, and that's the point. They want to stop these things. They want to stop all these expressions of dissent to US policy, and in particular, they want to stop the dissent directed at US policy towards Israel. The other hotspot is obviously college campuses, because if you think about social change in the United States, you need to win the college campus debate, and you need to win the churches. And right now we see a lot of activity on college campuses. You see professors and students and regulation of what they say and write. We just had a valedictorian at the University of Southern California be told she can no longer give the valedictorian speech because it's a security risk to have her speak, because she might say something that's about Gaza. She's a Muslim student there, and she has expressed her opinion on that subject, and so they're afraid of her speaking out at her graduation, so they just canceled her. We see all this kind of behavior going on with administrators actually calling in the police to arrest students who are engaged in a sit-in to protest. And this has never happened on any other issue, but it's happening on this particular issue. So we have to, if you want to be able to build a movement, you've also got to think about defensively being able to express dissent in this country. And I think that's a real challenge right now. And Laura could speak to that much more than I could, because that's her wheelhouse.
Yeah, I wonder if we might go to Lara next. And if you could tell us, maybe explain to the audience what the Foundation for Middle East Peace does in relationship to this question and what it doesn't do perhaps as well. And I want to make sure we have enough time for Iman, who's working with the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, because I want to make sure people know what that is as well. So Lara?
Sure, just very quickly, the Foundation for Middle East Peace, not too quickly because there's translation. We are a U.S. nonprofit. We are a grant maker in Israel-Palestine rights space and all that, on the ground in Palestine and in the U.S. and a little bit in Europe. And we are sort of a think tank. We don't do any lobbying at all. I speak about these things as a subject matter expert, we say. And as a subject matter expert, I just want to follow what Zaha is saying, you know, the no alternative to building power. And this is not a partisan thing, right? If you want to have impact, you have to have your voice. And like I said at the beginning, the US system is designed to be lobbied. And lobbying doesn't necessarily mean anything gross and icky. It means, in the simplest sense, as constituents, as people who vote, as people who pay taxes, as Americans, having your voice heard. And we know that there is, in the race to have one's voice heard, the Palestine rights voice is not nearly as far advanced as the voices of those who are pushing for Israel. But I also, and I mean, I'm never the positive voice in any conversation. I do think it's important to note, you know, over the past 6 months, we have seen movement in Congress. We have seen, if you look at some of the votes that have been taken recently, where 40 or 50 people are voting effectively for Palestine rights against something stupid, or where they're signing a letter for humanitarian aid, it's not enough, or people talking about ceasefire. That is not, and I wish I could say that is because people have voted, they're voting or speaking or signing their conscience. I don't think it is. I think it's not because this is right. I think it's because, yes, it aligns with their conscience, but more than that, they're understanding that there is a movement in their district, in their state, that will support them, doesn't just want them to do this, but that will support and defend them when they do this. And if you're someone who's ever interacted with members of Congress, you know, one of the things that you hear variations of from you know, lots of members of Congress, I think from both parties, would be the line that says, listen, I can do good things on every issue except this one, or I can speak out on this issue and I'll lose my seat and can't do good for anybody. And that's a cop-out, right? It's a cop-out. It's saying I can be hypocritical because it benefits other things. It's a cop-out. And yet, when Palestine movement voices, and this is Palestinian Americans, Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, Jewish Americans, Americans of color, and lots of white Americans who you would not think would have a dog in this fight, except they actually care about things like genocide, imagine that, are making their voices heard as never before. That's when you see an Elizabeth Warren take the position that she did. That's when you see a large number of people sign a letter for ceasefire. And I think it's really important, as we are all so, certainly I am dispirited about the general situation, to recognize that what we've seen in the almost, there still is not a Palestinian American equivalent of AIPAC or anything close to it. What we have is movement, and it's the US campaign and other groups who were prepared for this moment. And it's groups like If Not Now and JVP and SJP and a whole range who have done the work and prepared themselves now that they can jump in and start really gathering power and showing power in a way that we've never seen. And that is having impact. And I think that's something we should really learn the lesson from and take to heart. And it's not a partisan impact. It shouldn't be. This is about holding elected officials accountable as constituents, whoever you are, wherever you are.
Iman?
Yeah, I'll start with speaking to what the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights does. And our organizational mission is to actually bring awareness around what the United States involvement looks like with the state of Israel. So how has the United States showed up to uphold the walls of occupation and apartheid? What sort of funding gets passed to be able to uphold these systems? All that sort of thing. because one of the biggest criticisms around like, why are you focused so much on Palestine here in the US comes from the fact that this is just some sort of international issue, as if it's separate from domestic issues. And our job is to kind of bring up the American consciousness around that Palestine is not separated. It is not disconnected from the issues we are seeing here first and foremost. And I just want to acknowledge that like the movement has grown tremendously in the last couple of years because of the incredible leaders of different marginalized communities. There's the Black Liberation Movement. So folks are familiar with the Black Lives Matter movement that kind of was erupted really here in 2020. And even before that, we were able to draw connections and relationships with different marginalized communities in the US to be able to showcase that Palestine is not an issue that's standalone. It's an issue that's interconnected. It's an issue that matters a lot to other folks, and be it Indigenous rights activists who have been fighting for years here across Turtle Island, which recognizes the occupied North American territory, or if it's the climate justice movement and how greenwashing shows up in Palestine, how it's related back to the policies upheld here in the US, and if it's Black liberation movement, demands that get made around policing and mass incarceration and how it also relates back. So the movement has been able to build its own social capital because of its relationships that it's cultivated. And our job at the US campaign is to kind of both build up that coalition, build up that awareness across those different movements, as well as being able to help people understand how does the United States play a role in this specific issue. And so under RC3, which is kind of our non-political entity, we are able to build up campaigns around different awareness and educational campaigns to help build that up. And we spend a lot of time also building ourselves and helping people construct coalitions. So this is spaces where different partners and organizations can kind of come into that are like-minded and work together. As Lara said, like we are not, I don't think we're here to like think that we're going to create as much power as AIPAC has in this moment. And we definitely can't do that individually, but we can do that together. And so I think that we watched that happen over the last 6.5 months, that if we move together, if we are clear about our demands in the same exact way, if we are cohesive in language, I think it becomes a lot easier for people to understand what is it that the Palestinian movement is calling for. And it's been really effective in doing that. It's been able to convince people like Elizabeth Warren to make these statements. It's been able to keep people in the same positions over the last couple of months. I mean, there are a number of electeds that I don't even think we thought would ever call for a ceasefire that have ended up calling for a ceasefire because of the ability of the movement. I want to also kind of speak to, we have a C4 arm, which is a political arm that's been able to kind of build up, again, the same level of like the same approach, help people understand how does the US play this role, but be able to kind of really address ourselves and become a little bit more involved in the political arena. It is hard, you want to be able to convince members of Congress as to why certain issues are important, why they should take certain positions. But if they don't have the American voter constituency behind them, they're not going to care about why and what it is that you're asking for. And so it's been really important for us to kind of build up this arm so that we can also inform people on, as voters, as people who can come up and actually can vote whether or not they choose to keep these people in, and be able to build up that political power. So being able to have meetings with members of Congress with, a group of constituents is far more powerful than just us as advocates going into this meeting and being able to say, this is an issue you need to care about, but with no, there's nothing that they're gaining out of that. And so we're trying to do something similar to what AIPAC has been doing, and they're able to influence voters, and we can do the same. And that's what people are doing. And under that arm, we've actually joined this large coalition, which is called the Reject AIPAC Coalition, which is actually the largest coalition made up of different partners, different PACs that endorse candidates, that are able to support candidates and whatnot, and start actually building up this awareness around why AIPAC has been so harmful. We haven't really talked about it here, but I mean, AIPAC has really kind of hurt itself, and not just with its unwavering support for Israel, but it started to align itself with far-right members of Congress. Many can recall just in the last couple of years that when Joe Biden was, elected into his presidency, there was an insurrection, which is when a bunch of white supremacists actually came upon the Capitol, and we watched the insurrection unfold. And a lot of those members of Congress who supported those insurrectionists are supported by AIPAC. And it's not necessarily an alignment that's worked in their favor. And so people are actually able to draw this relationship between, AIPAC and authoritarianism and fascism, which has been extremely harmful to them. And so the coalition itself is actually about deconstructing how AIPAC operates, being able to allow people to understand that, and just showcasing how harmful it is to continue accepting AIPAC funding, and be able to kind of leverage you know, the dissent that's growing around this specific lobbying firm. So I just want to acknowledge that that's also an ongoing effort that's being made.
Thank you all. That's really helpful. And I'm starting to see in the Q&A a number of wheels churning, right? Some ideas starting to be generated in there. And so I think what I would like to do next is just share some of the things that are coming through in the Q&A. And those who are posing questions, you'll just have to forgive me for linking together some of these questions and clustering them. But I want to hear your responses to some of those ideas. There were a couple of questions that asked whether there are some laws or rules, whether US laws or international laws that might be marshaled to exert pressure. Someone asked whether, we just finished our taxes in the United States, whether not paying taxes as a conscientious objector might be a strategy. One person asked as well whether things like Michael Palin's House of Palestine is a productive way of intervening. And then there was a question as well that I think speaks to this issue. How important really is this issue for US elections, right? If it's so important, is that perhaps somewhere that pressure can be exerted? If it's not that important everywhere, might other strategies be more pertinent? And I think I would like to start with Lara for this, if that's okay. I think you might have some things to say, particularly about international law and US law in this regard.
Thanks. I'm actually going to let Zaha take most of that because she's the actual lawyer on this call. I will say that efforts to sort of there have always been efforts to say, well, let's use this US law, which if you actually implement it would require the US to end impunity or to put pressure. None of that's ever worked. The US Congress is generally willing to overlook Israel-related applications of US law if they're going to be difficult for Israel. We see administrations doing really complicated gymnastics to avoid having to have a semblance of being consistent when it comes to international law and Israel. That doesn't mean it's not worth pursuing, and maybe I think for sort of the public narrative, demonstrating hypocrisy side of it, but I have yet to see any real success in that way. I think some of that may be shifting a little bit. We're seeing the continued pressure on this administration when it comes to the question of whether Israel is violating US law when it comes to not allowing humanitarian aid to flow and then not still being able to get US weapons, which does really appear to be a brazen violation of our own laws. I don't know. In terms of the taxes, I'll leave that to people who do organizing to talk about. The last one, though, how important is this? I just want to take that very briefly, because I have, argued with people, for years who, when I've said, you need to pay attention to the battle over anti-Semitism and the effort to conflate anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel and anti-BDS laws. And my friends, particularly on the Democratic side of the aisle, say, this is silly. Nobody cares about this. This isn't going to have an impact on elections. It's not important. And really what's happened is, it is important. And it's important even if it's not the top issue. Let's say before October 7th, because I think with October 7th, it is important in its own right. There is a large constituency of Americans that are not happy that US policy and US taxes are supporting genocide. They're simply not happy about that. And I don't think anyone who's trying to navigate the role of this in this issue in 2024 elections can ignore that. It's unprecedented because Israel hasn't been this kind of issue before, because Israel hasn't been in the middle of an active, full-on genocide. There's obviously been the ongoing Nakba for the entirety of Israel's existence. It never stopped in the West Bank, we know that, and wars on Gaza and all that. But what's happening now is a different intensity. So I think it's clearly important, but it's important regardless, because the fact that on the one hand, the Republicans in the post-Tea Party era, so we're dating this to the early aughts, the reframing of a Republican Party around these red meat issues, where Israel is one of them, linked to evangelical Christianity. So on the one hand, it is used as by the Republicans a weapon against Democrats by saying we are the true pro-Israel party and you're not. We saw this in both elections with Obama. We saw this in the Biden in the first election when Trump was elected. We're seeing it now, saying that you cannot, is being supportive of Israel is a core U.S. value, and Republicans claiming Democrats aren't up to the fight. And on the other hand, Democrats, and particularly progressive Democrats who, we all know the term progressive except on Palestine. You have this idea that you can be a progressive Democrat and have a carve out for anything related to Palestine rights, which today puts you in league with Republicans on fighting free speech, on fighting academia, on a whole range of what are supposed to be the things that you want to defend. And it's incredibly problematic. And I've said for years, if the Democratic Party is not able to figure out a way to embrace a spectrum of views on Palestine, then it's always going to be the least common, most pro-Israel, right-wing common denominator. That's what they're going to always end up at. And that's where we are today. And again, anyone who's watching the hearings on the Hill going after universities is seeing this. And at that point, it is every single round, every single election season, it is a weapon that is brought out against anybody who gets an inch out of line. And what we saw in the primaries last time around was a warning of what would happen now, and we're seeing it again. And it's not just preventing, new, progressive, particularly women of color coming in. It's Andy Levin, right? It's a Democratic Jewish legislator from Michigan, from one of the most popular and powerful political families of that state, whose real crime in the eyes of AIPAC and company isn't even what he said or didn't say on Israel and Palestine. It's that he defended his colleagues, Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. That's his crime. And for that, and he might have lost his primary anyway for redistricting reasons, but millions of dollars was put into that primary by AIPAC. And when he lost, AIPAC claimed it as a victory for a pro-Israel agenda. They claimed it. It's not just us asserting it, they claimed it. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. That was very helpful. I'm going to just insert two other suggestions that came in the Q&A as we move to Iman. And I might go to Zaha last because we need that legal perspective. One of the things that did come up in the Q&A was the U.S. Foreign Assistance Act. I wonder if you could speak to that when we get to you. But there was also, and this is maybe more for Iman, there was a question about local politics, whether these ceasefire resolutions we're seeing perk up in a number of places, including nearby here in Greensboro, North Carolina, whether they're effective ways. And then one more thing I will put in as a caveat to just sort of recognize that not all of the people in attendance are situated in the United States. We have many Palestinians in the West Bank and allies sort of across the globe who are here in attendance. And so we might want to think what they might do as well. So Iman, to you, and then to Zaha directly after.
Yeah, I realize I want to take a second and say that I'm so sorry, everyone. This is such a depressing conversation in the sense sometimes we realize just how just incapable the United States is in upholding itself, in the same ways it upholds other countries. I think there's just such an exception for Israel. And when it comes to the Palestinian people, it fails them. It fails them every single time. It fails them like it had an opportunity for the last 6.5 months, 195 days to do something, and it's still not doing anything about it. And so I truly, as someone who is Palestinian living in the United States, I'm absolutely ashamed of what we have seen and what we're uncovering here. So I just want to acknowledge that. I think I want to acknowledge, but I am so sorry. Michelle, do you mind repeating the question again? Because I think I heard it a little bit, but then I think it disrupted.
Yes. So there have been a number of suggestions that have been put in the Q&A, and you heard the earlier ones, but one additional one was about whether local politics, these ceasefire resolutions we're seeing in state and city legislative bodies, whether those are good ways to do with it. And then there was also a call to remember that not all of our participants are located in the United States. So we might want to think about what people outside and people in Palestine can do.
Yeah, definitely. So when it comes to the local work, I want to acknowledge that it's only been amplified in the last couple of months. It's been, localized work is actually something that we've been encouraging people to take for years now. I think that's because of how distant Congress and the Biden administration or any presidential administration oftentimes seem from the American public. It's not an easily approachable institution. It's not an easily approachable arm. And many people are also not physically located in the DMV to be able to attend and meet their members of Congress in Capitol Hill. But the fortunate thing is especially when it comes to congressional districts, many of their members go back to their homes in their own localities. And even then, it could be difficult to, have conversations with folks, be able to influence them, but it's not necessarily, impossible. There are local offices in these local districts, and oftentimes, people are present, there's staff, there's all these folks that they can potentially lobby. But outside of Congress and outside the members, specifically like, the House and the Senate, many folks have turned to their state legislators. Many people have turned to their city council representatives. So these are more localized elected leaders across the American cities here that people have been able to confront and have easier access to. And people have been able to also unfold and kind of also deconstruct how each of these arms, these local arms, has participated in the overall investment in Israel. And it's not, again, just in the same way as we were talking earlier about how these pro-Israeli firms have showed up in more localized places. There's a lot of investments that get made in local, municipalities into the state of Israel. There are, even organizations that are tax exempt that exist in people's cities that are upholding and funding Israeli settlements. So there are targets. There's weapons manufacturers. So think of the large weapons manufacturers that create the bulldozers and the weapons themselves, that we've seen being used by Israel. They exist in these American cities. And so people are easily able to target those things from within. And I think that's really powerful in the fact that people have been able to kind of map them out themselves and identify, okay, like what are the different approaches we can take? Do we want to potentially pass? And as many people have, over 70 cities have been able to pass what's called ceasefire resolutions, which is our symbolic resolutions in favor of a total and permanent ceasefire. And then there's also things beyond that, divestment resolution. So how do we actually divest our cities, divest universities, divest whatever institutions we're talking about at the local level from this, is the Israeli system and as a whole. And so people have been going so far above and beyond and be able to build up those sorts of, campaigns, be able to do the work, research what's needed, research what's necessary. And it's really actually most important because it's expanding the public support. It allows more people to become familiar with the issue, and it allows more people to want to engage at the higher level. So it actually kind of trickles itself up back to Congress and so that we can build up the political will that's necessary to get the political shift that we need. So it plays a huge role in all of that. So for us, again, at USCPR, we are oftentimes working with folks at the local level to be able to address and build up those campaigns because they do have an incredible impact beyond those cities themselves. And I think for people outside the US, I think that there's a lot being done as well in different parts of the world. Divestment is something that I think more people have started to pick up. It looks different based on the municipalities and the regions you're coming from, but it's not impossible. It's something that's reachable from mostly anywhere.
Zaha?
Thanks. So let's talk about laws and policy in the US. We actually have a lot of good law on the subject of weapons transfers. I mean, we have I think someone was asking about the Foreign Assistance Act that essentially says that if we transfer weapons to a country, that it should be consistent with internationally recognized human rights. And we have an Arms Export Control Act, which basically says that weapons transfers should be used for legitimate self-defense purposes. And, obviously, that's not what's happening in this case. What's happened in Gaza in particular with the use of U.S. weapons, clearly U.S. supplied weapons, given what we've seen, the kinds of munitions that have been used, the size of the bombs that have been dropped, the planes that have been used to drop those bombs, all of that is U.S. supplied equipment. And it's not for defense, obviously, if you're using those kinds of weapon systems in densely populated areas. So there should have been an inquiry into the misuse of weapons. We have not had one single congressional hearing about the misuse of weapons, which tells you something about sort of the priorities. What we have had are at least 3 hearings on campus speech related to the protests around what's happening in Gaza, but not about U.S. supplied weapons. The Biden administration itself has made it a matter of national security, and it published this in their national security strategy, that promoting human rights and centering it in our foreign policy is a priority. And so you would imagine then that there would be much more interest in examining what's happened with Israel's use of U.S. supplied weapons in Gaza. But the Biden administration has, in fact, at every turn, either said that it hasn't had enough information to be able to accurately assess whether or not Israel is misusing U.S. supplied weapons in contravention of these laws that I just mentioned, or they've said that nothing that they've seen so far, or these things are ongoing, these assessments are ongoing, and they have to wait and see what happens. And after all the assessments are in 6 months later, they still haven't assessed it and they don't know. So, this is the problem, is you have to have some political will to enforce the laws. You have these laws on the books. They don't give individuals a standing to go to court and say the U.S. is violating the Foreign Assistance Act or the Arms Export Control Act. That has to be something that is pushed by Congress, something that the administration takes up, and they haven't done that. The Biden administration itself has actually talked a lot about civilian protection. They're interested in making sure that civilians in conflict are protected, particularly where U.S. has a stake in that conflict zone. And again, on those particular policy statements, the U.S. hasn't enforced them in this particular instance. I would imagine that, given the extent of U.S. involvement in the current situation in Gaza, the fact that it's U.S. supplied weapons that are mainly being used, the fact that the U.S. is providing diplomatic cover at the UN Security Council and blocking resolutions, the fact that it's also put pressure on third states to fall in alignment with U.S. policy, that it should be concerned about complicity in the genocide that is arguably taking place in Gaza. And we have seen now middle powers like South Africa take cases to the ICJ. We've seen Nicaragua take Germany to the ICJ for its complicity in supporting Israel militarily. The U.S. should be concerned about its complicity, but it feels perhaps emboldened because of the fact of its influence throughout the world and its position. But that only gets you so far. One of the priorities of the Biden administration and Democrats writ large is this notion that we need to rebuild multilateral institutions. We need to promote normative conduct and be an example of that. It's not the example in this particular case. It's really undermining U.S. policy objectives around the world, and it's forcing and providing ammunition to the middle powers that are saying, you tell us what about human rights in our countries? You tell us that, we need to be held accountable, but you're supporting the worst atrocities that have taken place in modern times in Gaza. And how dare you ever come back to us and tell us about human rights? And so it's really undermining the U.S. role in the world. It's undermining the national interest that the U.S. has, and it's undermining our own national security strategy.
Thank you all. We just have a couple of minutes left, and I want to ask you to each end by what do you think is the most important thing that you want our listeners to take away from this discussion? Or actually, maybe I'll ask it in a different way. Again, acknowledging that most of our attendees are coming to us from within the region. What practical steps would you encourage them to consider that might help raise awareness, build solidarity, something that they can do? So a takeaway, but maybe leaning towards practical steps for our attendees from within the region. And who would like to start? Lara, can I ask you to start?
Sure. Listen, I'm not an organizer or an activist, so I come at this with great humility. I am grateful for people in the region who care about the U.S. side of this and who haven't lost all hope and who are listening and attending this. I would say continue to educate yourself. Look to the people in, we in Washington and we in the U.S. increasingly, I think, are recognizing that, well, we've always known that centering Palestinian voices is part of the problem, that we're not doing that. But I think this is a moment when that's increasingly breaking through, and we are really looking to center voices in the region, Palestinians in Palestine and in the diaspora, and their counterparts in the US. This is bigger than just a US issue. Speaking up, being active, being educated, and engaging. And with, I have to say, with social media, the borders are a lot less relevant. You can be part of these conversations, and being part of the conversation from the region, particularly if you're on the ground in Palestine or in Palestinian communities across the region, your lived experience is part of what has been missing, certainly in the US for a very long time, and continuing to make people hear that and demand rights, just like everybody else in the world. I think your voices can be heard now like never before.
Zaha, can you go next?
Yeah, I was going to say something very similar. I work in policy. You can't get support around policy if there's no empathy for whoever you're talking about. And because Palestinians haven't had their story out there as much and in the past, and haven't been organized in the past, and haven't had access to media that they do now, that's been difficult. I see now that things are changing rapidly with social media, and I want to encourage people to keep telling their stories and keep doing so on social media. It's penetrating, like Lara said. It's what's creating this dissonance between what U.S. policy is and what people are seeing, and they recognize something's wrong. So I don't have any expert advice on that. You guys are already doing it. I would just say keep doing it and be careful. It's a very dangerous time to be in the occupied territories these days. And, I just want to acknowledge that as well.
And it's appropriate. We end with Iman, who does work in advocacy and organizing. If you could give us our takeaways, please.
Yeah, I also don't take this lightly, but I mean, putting your lives and first person perspectives online is so, you're just risking everything, and I completely understand. While at the same time, people all over the world have turned to, social media, be it Twitter, TikTok, whatever it is, whatever platform Palestinians have chosen to use, people are listening, people are watching. And it's really been able to influence, again, this overall political will and understanding of the Palestinian people in tremendous ways. And so while I'm not a fan of necessarily having to display our own, atrocities online, unfortunately, it's also a reason behind why people are able to empathize more. And so I would say if you can do it within, being secure, whether it's protecting, your name, or whatever it is, using a fake name, just anonymizing yourself, in any way, is extremely important. But whatever you want to put out, I mean, I know that we are honestly trying to our best to make sure that we're always uplifting what's happening. We get the latest updates from the people in Gaza, the West Bank, across all of Palestine. And I mean, without people doing that, it's impossible. But if there's also anything that we could do to support via email or whatever else, we just have to make sure that we uplift whatever is happening, whatever is possible. We really do learn from the people on the ground. That's how we're informed. So I would just echo all of that.
So in keeping with that, I will just say that I don't take for granted our ability to engage this issue from a position of safety, but I acknowledge that some of us have a bit more safety to be braver than others. And so I want to thank these three panelists for being part of this discussion. I want to thank An-Najah National University for providing the space for us to think about these issues, and to all of you for attending and working to raise awareness, to build solidarity, and educating yourselves in the ways that this panel helped and that all of us hopefully will continue to do. So thank you so much for being here, being a part of this. Thank you again to our panelists. A round of applause. I'm sure we're hearing, although Zoom hinders our ability to hear it. And thank you to the audience as well.
Thank you.
Thank you all.